Welcome to the Resilient Surgeon, part of the STS Surgical Hot Topics podcast. Our goal with the Resilient Surgeon series is to inspire our colleagues to be their best selves in and out of the operating room, using scientifically proven tools and recovery strategies of the world's top performers. I'm Dr. Michael Mattis, and in each episode, I will talk to game changers who will share evidence-based practices, real-world strategies, and their own personal stories and experiences to help you build your resilience and to help you be your best self no matter what. Our guest today on The Resilient Surgeon is Tim Pychyl, and the topic is procrastination. I have to admit that if someone had suggested the idea of having a guest on The Resilient Surgeon to talk about procrastination, I would have balked, since I was under the illusion that surgeons, in general, don't procrastinate. But I changed my mind one morning as I'm grinding away on the elliptical and flipping through the YouTube thumbnails that Google dealt me that day, when one with the famous YouTuber Ali Abdaal interviewing Tim Pychyl on procrastination caught my eye. It turns out that Tim is one of the world's experts on the science of procrastination, and since it involves science, well, I gave it a click. Soon into the video, I realized that I am indeed a procrastinator. But what is procrastination? It's not equal to delaying things, since as Tim says, all procrastination is delay, but not all delay is procrastination. Instead, his definition of procrastination is the following. Procrastination is the voluntary delay of an intended action despite the knowledge that the delay may harm the individual in terms of the task performance or even just how we feel about the task. To me, that sounds like anything that can lead to an addiction. And when procrastination gets embedded into your life, it can absolutely be as bad as an addiction by negatively affecting your long-term goals and even your relationships. One example of mine is finalizing our will and trust. I'm 70 years old, and I procrastinated on a long overdue update since it involves complicated trust issues and decisions. My example highlights why we all procrastinate. Our feelings, specifically the avoidance of short-term pain and the pursuit of short-term pleasure. My brain desperately wants to avoid the pain of redoing my will and trust and having to deal with all the complicated stuff and decisions involved. So every time I sit down with that stack of papers and stuff to look at, my brain's desire for short-term pleasure to avoid the pain kicks in. So instead, my brain conjures up a litany of excuses instantaneously. Things like, well, I need to work out, or I better check my email to see if John wrote back, or my dog Juno had been laying around a long time and she needs a walk. Besides, this whole thing can wait until tomorrow, or better yet, Saturday, when I can have more time and peace. This is the game going on upstairs in our brains, and Tim Pychyl is here today to help us get a better understanding of this beast called procrastination and what we can do to tame it. Tim is a Canadian psychologist who spent his career at Carleton University in Ottawa, Ontario, studying procrastination, and he is the author of the incredibly practical and actionable book, Solving the Procrastination Puzzle. Not only that, but he has a series about procrastination on my very favorite app of all time, the Waking Up app by Sam Harris. It's spectacular, and I urge you to consider giving it a listen. And now I bring you Tim Pychyl. Tim, welcome to the Resilient Surgeon, and thank you so much for being here as our guest today.
Well, it's my pleasure to meet you, Michael.
Yeah. So the topic today is procrastination, and I suspect a number of our listeners, that is surgeons, may think that procrastination is not really a problem for them since they've clearly shown high levels of activation and discipline to get where they need to go. But as you state in your wonderful book, procrastination is a problem that affects all of us. And I think as we roll through the conversation today, we'll highlight some areas where even us cardiothoracic surgeons may procrastinate and it may be detrimental to our lives. So we'll touch on those as we go. But I thought I would just, your wonderful short book that is so practical, I thought it would be just perfect to just kind of go through the chapters one by one, and because they
Hmm.
highlight the important principles, and of course, feel free to deviate any way you want to highlight things. Does that work for you, Tim?
Absolutely. And I just want to add, and by way of introduction to that theme, that people who are high achieving, well, of course they don't have a procrastination problem. Look how
Yeah,
much
yeah,
they've achieved in their lives. And
yeah.
I was a very reluctant consultant, and I got asked by the National Judicial Institute in Canada to work with judges. And I thought, my goodness, what do I have to offer these people? Right? They are so accomplished, and
Yes.
when I got to meet them, so wise and smart, like really a great group. But they resonated to the story I tell about procrastination because it's not just needless delay. It's a whole bunch of things where we find ourselves getting in our own way that underlines our under really undermines our
Undermine.
well-being.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, it's a problem for many people, no matter how much we've achieved. And on one more side note in that regard, over 28 years of supervising students doing theses, I had many very talented students come and want to study procrastination, A+ students, but they were really good at procrastinating too.
Yeah, and that underscores just how ubiquitous and pervasive this issue is. And
Mhm.
I have to say, I kind of recognized where I might be procrastinating a little bit, but I didn't think it was kind of a big deal. But now that I've read your book, I realize I've been very successful in some arenas like
Mhm.
exercise and some other things. But there are other areas where I have not been successful, and I am clearly a procrastinator. No doubt about
Well,
it.
that's interesting. I mean, we don't want to linger too long here, but I would have to turn that around and say I used to procrastinate, but I don't really. Before we even turned on the recording, we were talking about things. I was talking about how my tractor broke down, and I just seem to be fixing things. And you said, yeah, the only thing you seem to be able to control is your procrastination. And there's a huge amount of truth in that. So I think as a foreshadow for listeners, that
Uh,
you really can stop procrastination if you want to. And what we're going to talk about over the next few minutes are ways to do that.
yeah, and I meant that phrase because after you're reading your book, it's very clear you can't. I mean,
Yeah, you can.
absolutely doable,
Hmm.
as you say, with the full commitment to accomplishing that goal, full
That's right.
commitment. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, you open up your book about procrastination with the concept of delay versus procrastination and the differences
Mhm.
between, I guess, conscious and thoughtful delays that are manifest as part of the environment or what's coming at you and your busyness versus procrastination. Maybe you could tell us the difference between delays and what kind of a delay procrastination is.
Well, as I was mentioning, I wrote that book 14 years ago now. And since that time, I had a doctoral student, now he's Dr. Mohsen Hagman, do research just on that. So I'm going to be referring to his research. And not only did we differentiate delay from procrastination, but we differentiated different kinds of delay. So let me back it up a bit and say
Hmm.
that we define procrastination as the voluntary delay of an intended act, despite the expectation that we'll probably be worse off for the delay. So that's really important to unpack. The voluntary delay. There's no gun next to my head. There's no
Hmm.
pressing outside concern that the hospital didn't just call and say that my wife's been admitted and so I drop everything. It's that no, I'm choosing to delay. And I'm delaying something that I already intended. And that was my practical reason said, all things considered, I should be doing this right now. And a little bit of me knows that this is probably going to come back and bite me on the butt. Now, it's
Hmm.
only a probability statement because the world's not completely predictable. And we love that because we can all remember a time when we procrastinated and it paid off. And we
Yes.
hang
I
on to
was
that like gold.
I
Yeah.
was going to ask you, is there any scenario where procrastination pays off? And I suspect that there is, as you mentioned just now. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, I think we could all think of examples. I had one where a big tree fell across the road here. It took the power lines out. The police came, hydro came. They did the initial cleanup, and this is a huge tree. They said, "Okay, the rest is yours." And I thought, "Oh my goodness, like I'm a busy guy, and as much
Yeah.
as I love my chainsaw, I'm not doing that right now." I procrastinated for a week, and they came and they cleaned it up, so
There
it
you
paid.
go. Perfect
Yeah,
example. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So anyhow, we don't want to linger too much. So we see that procrastination is a voluntary delay. It's a type of delay. But there's other kinds of delay in our lives. There's purposeful delay. So that we purposefully delayed our recording until today. There were
Yes.
other days when we thought about it, but for good reason, we delayed it until today's. So we can call that a sagacious delay. It's really important to
Hmm.
know that,
Hmm.
right, delay is part of life and it can be wise. And then there's inevitable delay. We almost ran into that today when my computer died.
Hmm.
Inevitably, these
Hmm.
sorts of things
Hmm.
happen. And if you don't understand an inevitable delay, go book a flight, right?
Right.
You're going to find that
There you'll
happening.
find it. Yeah.
Yeah. And you can't see where I'm sitting. You can see some of my environment, but next to me here is a picture of my father who died in 2016.
Hmm.
And when he died, my world came apart for a little while. The wheels came off, you could say, and things didn't get done. But never once did I say, "Oh, Tim, you're such a terrible procrastinator."
Yeah.
Uh, and we call this delay due to emotional problems. So here's three common kinds of delay that have nothing to do with procrastination. And we have to understand that delay is part of life. Some things sometimes have to wait. Other times things just inevitably get delayed. And then there's delay when things happen in life and our self-regulation is undermined. So that's really important to understand right from the outset that although all procrastination is delay, not all delay is procrastination. And so each one of us has to recognize, okay, where is the problem here? Not getting the laundry put away some nights is not necessarily procrastination. You've
Hmm.
gotten everything important done that day and you've run out of time or energy.
Hmm.
That's
Hmm.
just life. But when you're looking at something and you know that I intended to do this morning, it's really important that I had done it and I didn't. There's your problem.
And there were no intervening issues, as you mentioned, that caused that delay, an appropriate and, as you say, wise delay, a wise
Right.
delay. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
the first definition I gave you comes from a colleague at University of Calgary, Piers Steele. I'm going to give you another definition that the judges really resonated to. It comes from a
Hmm.
philosopher at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, Joel Anderson, and he says procrastination is unwarranted, culpable delay. So
Hmm.
that there's no good reason it's unwarranted, and for that you're culpable. And that really sums it up nicely. Do I feel culpable? Then there's a good reason to believe that it was unwarranted.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And, I want to emphasize in your book how, for the listeners, how you strike this beautiful tone of humanity
Mm.
combined with a certain, like, a little bit in your face too, And as a surgeon, I like that. That's appealing to me. Bring it on, baby. Bring it on. You know, our responsibility. Some discipline, and then, as you said, culpability, because we do have to own these things. Right? To some
Yes.
extent, we have to own these things. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
I think
you
if I
mentioned.
remember at one
Go
point in
ahead.
the book, I did write that if you're not willing to do this, then put the book down right now.
Oh,
And
it's very explicit, and I thought, right on. It's the
yeah.
truth. There's no point in
Mhm.
reading this if you're not going to do it. You're just
Yeah.
procrastinating again. Yeah, no, it was brilliant. That's this thing I'm talking about. But the other, you mentioned the delay of emotional turmoil is when your father died and that. And I just want to highlight for people, because I think it's a common issue with surgeons and people that are high performers. We feel often that we just have to go immediately back at it when very emotionally turbulent event happens in our lives. This is a common theme, and you just get up, brush off, dust off, reload, and get back in the stream of things.
Mhm.
And that's a recipe for problems, as I've learned both in my personal life and for others, because Jeff Bridges talks about needing to go in the neutral zone, which is basically a delay. When you have a big event like you're moving or you have a death in the family or something like that, the emotional turbulence doesn't allow you to think clearly and get the space needed to make the right decision. So that's a very important delay in that time. I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, and what it's also you're speaking to there is a lack of self-compassion. And I
Yes.
think we'll get to that in our
Yeah.
discussion
It's very
today.
important.
Mhm.
Yeah. So that's what delay versus procrastination is. And then the second part is you talk about procrastination as failing to get on with life itself. All
Mm.
right.
Yeah, this is
Unpack that for us.
well, I'm not a clinical psychologist, but years ago I attended a clinical conference on meaning and dealing with those who are grieving. And I went to
Mhm.
a talk, and some psychologists had done some research. Were talking about the regrets of those who were grieving. I really pushed hard on with some questions. What are these regrets? Not surprisingly, they were things like not doing what they said they were going to do with that person until it was too late. And it became very obvious that procrastination is not just a matter of an all-nighter or two. It's a deeply existential issue. As I
Yes.
joked with, and in fact, a physician last night. I was at one of my son. My son is my youngest, and he's still in high school, and he's in the concert band and the jazz band. They were playing last night, and afterwards, I was talking to one of their parents, who's a physician, and we were talking about lots of things, including his retirement and his lack of self-compassion around that. But I left a pause there because I needed to. You're going to have to cut that because
That's
I
right.
just lost my train of
All
thought
good.
for half a
Yeah.
second. Yeah. And I'm going to come right back to it.
Is the omission commission, the grieving conference.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Good. Okay. And, and as we were talking about his upcoming retirement, he not only did he have a lack of self-compassion in terms of, he said, I'm always the kind of person who needs to be doing things for others and having a purpose. And it'll be interesting to see if I can do that later. And I said, yeah, well, this thing about life, it's not a dress rehearsal. To which
Mhm.
he just it
Do it
set him right
later.
back.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is the thing with procrastination is that this is your life. And oftentimes when we're procrastinating, especially for younger people, I'll say, this is your life. You need to get on with it. Like if you're not going to do these things, then what is it you're going to do? But living in this zone where you're stewing your own juices is really problematic. And
It
so
is problematic. Yes.
there was the example of, facing death, but there's the everyday example of a whole day of your life goes by. And why this is so important is that in every world religion, there's the notion of sloth as this deadly sin, amongst other labels we might give it,
Yes.
because time is the most precious commodity we have. It's probably the only non-renewable resource we have in our own personal
Hmm.
lives, and we don't
Hmm.
even know how much we're going to get. So to
Hmm.
waste it is terribly problematic, and so that's why
Hmm.
I highlight that early in the book to say that this isn't a matter of just being a more efficient person. This is a matter of living the life that you want to live.
And that's the key thing because one can fall into the trap of the day, and that is being hyper productive, seize the day, do more, all these things. But that's not what you're talking about. It's talking about doing the things that you value and the goals that you have for your life. And I'm saying these, but you tell me where I'm getting it wrong.
No, you've got it right on. And if I could flip my calendar on and let everyone look at my calendar, you'd think, what are you doing here? Like every 15 minutes of my day is blocked off. I'm retired, by the way,
Mhm.
but every 15 minutes of my day is blocked off. And I do it proactively in terms of planning, and I do it retroactively as in terms of where I spent my time. And I also color code the whole thing so I can look at my week forensically and say,
Mhm.
is this the life I want to live? Because time is so precious to me. It's a little bit like looking at your MasterCard or Visa balance and saying, am I spending money where I want to be spending
Yeah, it
it?
really is. Yeah.
But a lot more important. So the interesting thing there for me is that time management is necessary, but not sufficient. And the
Right.
rest of our conversation is going to be, okay, I get it. Time's really important. I
Yeah.
want to be using it more effectively. How do I get there? Because just having a daily planner doesn't do it.
Yeah. This may be a good moment to talk about clinicians and my own experience, which I think will resonate with a lot of the audience. You know, I had a 360-degree review and as part of my leadership course that I created. And one of the comments in there was, um, you know, I was a very forceful individual, back in the day. And one of the comments was, he's like an abusive boyfriend who you absolutely adore, but can never be sure won't slap you. And many of the listeners will have heard me say this in previous podcasts, but it seems germane here. And what I did at the time when I reread that a few years after I got it, because I kind of discounted it at first, I sent it to my children
Mm.
and they were in full. I have six kids, and five of them, one was too young to understand it, but the other five were like, "Yeah, that's it. That's a situation. We love you dearly. We respect you enormously, but we can't come to you with any problems or anything. There's a lack of real connection and vulnerability that's available to us." And that was such a trigger for me to change. And this gets at the omission thing because
Mm.
I feel so good now about what I did in terms of repairing that issue with my
Mm,
children and others. Uh, that my relationship with my children, I feel like I've accomplished one of the greatest things in my life to get that level of deep connection and trust and vulnerability with them that was not present before, that I wasn't even aware wasn't present, and I was so
yeah,
blind by the busyness of my life and that. So it was a big deal. And I can say, honestly, I'm 70. I'll go to the grave here in the near term, but I'm satisfied. I
that's great.
one of the most important things to me, because being a father has always been important to me, but I didn't manifest it in the way that I knew I could have, because I didn't really know any better at the time. But I managed to accomplish that. But it takes time and commitment and effort, to do that.
Wow, that's so disarmingly honest. Like it's a beautiful story. Although I can't imagine receiving that. It's like a slap in the head. And I can see why
Yes.
you rejected it at first. Like
At
who would
first,
write
yeah,
this kind of thing?
yeah.
But those truths are hard, are difficult, and you did the best thing with it, which was to take it and explore it and have other people you trust and love reflect on it. Wow, that's I learned a lot in that story. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, you're welcome. And my point is not so much about me, but it's about like anybody listening. Just think carefully about these issues of omission. We're all
Hmm.
heading to the cliff here. And and
Yes.
and be careful, in terms of your busyness and the things that you feel so compelled to do all the time, and be very clear in your choices of what you want to work on and do, So
Yeah, but there's a word that you slip past in there that what it requires is vulnerability.
yeah,
You have to be willing to be vulnerable to be open to that sort of change. So that was
yeah,
very powerful. Yeah.
yeah,
Thanks. That's
yeah,
great.
yeah,
And I
you
agree
bet.
with you. But you brought that together because of the omission and commission. And the omission, it can be things that because we're procrastinating.
Hmm.
Uh, yeah.
And then if you one thing is you talk about it is, and again, just highlight symptom procrastination is a symptom of existential malaise. All right.
Mm.
Can you just dig into that a little bit more? Because it's existential malaise is something that's very real. I mean, this is like, and we can surface above it, but it's always kind of percolating in the background, in my opinion, a little bit.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I think that's, Sartre, one of the famous
Hmm.
existentialists, would talk about it as living in bad faith. Like you're not being honest with yourself. You're not fully engaged in being the person you are. You can be acting the waiter. If you're a Sartrean scholar, you might get into this. We
Hmm.
could spend way too much time down this rabbit hole, but it's a deeply existential issue in terms of being in the world. Another existential term that we're not being. Another one is authentic.
Hmm.
All of these
Hmm.
things are being lost in our putting things off in a needless way because it takes a certain amount of dishonesty. There's a wonderful scholar retired from Stanford named John Perry, and he wrote a great little book. If you want to read another book on procrastination called The Art of Procrastination,
Art.
and in
Okay.
and in it, John argues that he's a terrible procrastinator. Now, I just finished saying he was a retired professor emeritus from Stanford. He
Hmm.
got a lot of things done. He goes, yes, I was known for getting a lot of things done, but I'm a terrible procrastinator because I'm a structured procrastinator. Now, the link to this earlier conversation comes here. He said, now a structured procrastinator um, puts at the top of their list something that seems important and urgent, but isn't. Now, it takes a certain level of self-deception here, but he says, don't worry, procrastinators are good at self-deception. So there's
Yeah.
that link to this notion of that Sartrean
Yeah.
notion of bad
Yeah.
faith and deception. And then I'll just finish the story and we'll go back to the existential malaise. But then what the structured procrastination is that you take all the effort in avoiding that first thing, of course, which you've carefully scripted as seems important but isn't, and he gets everything else done on his list. And I
Hmm.
said, well, John, that works for you, but the real procrastinators I know aren't on their list anymore. They're binge watching Netflix or they're doing
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
inane, like they're alphabetizing their spice rack, for God's sakes.
But and believe me, I would do that. I'm the kind of person who would alphabetize my spice rack. There's no question about it. God.
Yeah. So I went there only because of the self-deception and introducing you to John Perry because he's such a delightful guy and has written an interesting book called The Art of Procrastination. But I will add at the very end, he says he's not trying to make a vice into a virtue, which so many people do, and we might come back to that.
Mhm,
But that, and you can beat it if you want to. And he recommends some places that someone might go. But he's saying that sometimes it can be part of our nature, and he's learned to live within that nature. But so he tricks
mhm,
himself a little bit. Now, I don't think that's the best way to act. And
mhm,
John and I have had this conversation before. I'd rather deal with the existential malaise straight on. Now,
mhm,
another twist here that I didn't have in that book. So go back to Sartre again, and he would write about the fact that we can build guardrails in our lives. And there's lots of them built socially, like policemen and literally guardrails on a highway. And so sometimes then we can say, well, I know what I'm going to do. I'll do the Pomodoro technique, which means I put on a timer and I'll work while a timer's on. But just like the many other guardrails in life, whether they be the police or the actual guardrail, we realize they're socially constructed. And I just
mhm.
constructed this Pomodoro technique. And as soon as I recognize that it depends on me somehow, it all falls away. And so
Falls
there's
away.
something deeply existential problematic there too, that we
Yeah.
can't deal with procrastination with tricks and tips necessarily.
Yes, yes. And that's one of the chapters, and it's really important. And that was really illuminating to me because, I've tried all these various tips and tricks, and they don't stick with me, and this is the other part of this chapter, and that is the only solution per you is a deep commitment to change.
Mhm. And
Do I have that right?
self. Yes, and
Uh,
in that sense, a deep commitment to self, to
to
being
self,
the person
yes.
that you want to
Yes.
be.
Yeah.
And a deep commitment to change because it's always, and we say this about everything, it's two steps forward, one step back, right?
Mhm.
Change is not easy. And more on top of that, and maybe we'll come to this in different ways, but sometimes things that are, quote, bred in the bone, things that we have become deep patterns in our lives, they actually don't go away. They're bubbling in the background. And that we have to take what I learned from Joseph Goldstein, a rather
Oh yeah.
well-known meditation teacher. I
He's
love the
he's an
man.
he's an icon to me.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah,
And one of his,
literally.
well, then you'll know that one of his famous lines is, "It's okay to feel this way."
Yeah.
Like sometimes we have to just recognize that my amygdala is
Okay.
on fire.
Yeah. This
And
is
I'm
good.
going through all these patterns of thought and feeling that I've had before. Now, because we're talking about procrastination, it's probably around some tasks. You so wisely identified the fact that there's some domains where you don't have this problem at all, but other
Hmm.
domains you do. And it's there that all these patterns get lit up. And then one of the big solutions, it's deep in me, is that it's okay to feel this way. I don't
Yes.
have to run away because
Yeah.
procrastination is avoidance. And so that little saying, um, it's okay to feel this way. And the other one is then, and I get deeply Buddhist again, begin again, right? So
Hmm.
this commitment to change that's in that chapter is the notion of, yeah, I have to begin again. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, this is so wonderful. I mean, my hair is almost standing on end with these topics because the begin again thing, and I picked all this up from the Waking Up app by Sam Harris and listening to Joseph Goldstein, Alan Watts, and James Lowe, and
Hmm.
the begin again thing was as pivotal as that comment about the abusive boyfriend in my life. Because if my wife and I got in an argument, some issue, I would fume and fuss for, I don't know, it depends on the degree of the intensity, but I'd fume and fuss and kind of shut down and not talk as much for anywhere from 1 to 5 days, and it would be a form of withdrawal and sort of punishment, and
Hmm.
whatever, all the
And
mixes
control. Yeah.
and control. And I realized when I heard the begin again thing that I needed to change that. And that means you just begin again. You drop the
Yes.
drama, you drop the goddamn story. And if there's
Hmm.
anything worth talking about of merit within it, okay, you can have a conversation around it, but then just drop it. And I've learned to go down and no matter what, go down and kiss her and hug her right after an explosive upset, even. And it's been
Yeah.
revolutionary for our relationship, revolutionary.
Yes.
And for my
Yeah.
peace of mind and mental health.
Yeah. You're choosing to be happy.
Yes, literally
rather than
choosing to do something
stewing in
different.
your own juices.
Yeah,
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 that's
boy,
profound.
yeah, really important. Yeah.
There's a wonderful Buddhist story, a Zen story, of two monks walking down a trail, and they get to a big puddle, and there's a woman standing at the edge of the puddle. Now, the monks are never supposed to interact or touch women, but the one monk sees that she's afraid to cross the water. He scoops her up, carries her
I
across,
know
puts
this
her down.
story.
Okay, yeah, and so I'll
It's
finish it
so
for
great.
listeners then. Yeah, and so he puts her down, and they continue walking. And 5 minutes later, the monk who didn't pick the woman up said, "You know, we're not supposed to touch women." And he said, I put her down 5 minutes ago. And so,
Yeah,
you're letting
yeah.
go
You're
is
letting go.
another implicit in that
Yes.
begin again.
Yeah.
And it really speaks back to the vulnerability issue too. You couldn't have done any of that without being vulnerable. So all these themes, as much as
Hmm.
we are talking about procrastination, but these are foundational to the change in our lives that has to happen because
Yeah.
sooner or later we're going to get to perfectionism too, and we're going to see how this
Hmm.
all comes together. But
Yeah.
I'll let you continue with the
Well, no,
book.
but vulnerability, self-compassion, existential malaise, these are all the underpinnings of all of this stuff of living. Yeah. Really.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Wonderful. Okay, so what is the most important thing to know about procrastination? I won't give in to feeling good.
Mm.
Feeling good now comes at a cost. So there we're getting to the feelings and the negative emotions experienced that make us want to procrastinate.
Yep. That giving in to feel good is not an expression I came up with. It's some prominent American social psychologist, Roy Baumeister,
Mhm.
and his colleagues and students. I won't name them all. But they wrote a very influential paper for me, at least, in my thinking about procrastination, about as a form of self-control. And that what we do often in our lives is we give in now to feel good now at the cost of future self. And this can be giving in to feel good. I give in to eat a cookie. And so let's use that as an example. Most of us understand because nutritionists are so good at telling us this. When you get to the second row of cookies in the bag, you're not eating because you're hungry anymore. We know this as emotional eating. And so this failure in self-regulation is a giving in to feel good. And we see it with procrastination as well. Procrastination, I talked about my time management and I said it was necessary but not sufficient. With
Mhm.
time management, so when I face a task that I don't, it instills in me negative emotions, resentment. Why do I have to do this? Boredom. I can't believe I have to do this. Fear. You pick your favorite negative emotion associated with a task. Very early in life, we learn if I avoid the task, I can avoid the emotion, at least
Mhm.
in the short term. And that's
Mhm.
really what procrastination is. So it is a self-regulation failure of giving in to feel good. And so, in a nutshell, procrastination is not a time management problem, it's an emotion management problem.
Emotional management problem. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. And all you have to do is think about, well, I'll just check the Bitcoin price, or I'll just watch a YouTube short, you know, because it,
That's
it really
another
is relieving.
Yeah, but that's another great one. And so let's talk very practically here. If you ever find yourself saying it will only take a minute to know you're on procrastination's doorstep.
Yes,
And that can be things like I'll just watch one more episode, or I'll just check my
yes,
email, or I'll just,
yeah.
but it can also be I live out here in a farm and I do horse chores in the morning, and I might be having to, well, this is before I retired, I might have to review a manuscript or go look at something that's been reviewed for me and face those
Hmm.
awful reviews. So I'm
Hmm.
walking towards my house and I look at the tractor and I think, it'll only take me an hour to change the oil. And you're thinking,
Okay.
no, Tim, you're supposed to go work on your writing. And
Yeah,
so this
yeah.
will only take a minute. It should be a flag to you that what you're trying to do is to go back to what you said, give in to feel good. You're
Hmm.
trying to avoid some negative emotion associated with the task. And if you get that much from this talk today, it's a big doorway to stopping your procrastination because you recognize this is just going to come back and bite me. I'm not going to feel like it. Future self is not going to feel like it on Friday any
Has
more
no
than you
ability
do
to
now.
figure that out. Zero,
No, no.
zero.
Now, I don't know if I can't remember all the chapters in a row, but I'm not sure I dealt with future self as much as I did in subsequent research to that book. But Hal Hirschfield out of UCLA has done some wonderful work on future self, which we've done some research with too. And one thing we've learned is that when we take future self into account, we have more empathy for future self. And that empathy for future self was statistically related to less procrastination. So
Hmm.
doing that bit of time travel, thinking, I'll feel more like it tomorrow is what comes out of our mouths most of the time. Um, there's a couple of good reasons we feel that way, but they're specious. They're not real. And in fact, future self just hates you, right? And if
Hmm.
we take into account future self a little bit by thinking about how's future self going to feel on Friday, we're more likely to act now.
Hmm. And it's, of course, the ultimate future self is, the omission issue, isn't it? And death.
Yeah, and
Pre,
that's really the ultimate future self, absolutely.
yeah.
And that's
And
both existential and Buddhist.
yeah, yeah. And
Mhm.
it gets at, again, like my children as an example, I mean, the fact that I was rescued in a way from finding myself at 70 with a significant sense of disconnection from my children that might have persisted, if I had not
Mhm.
been made aware of it. Yeah.
Mhm.
So you said, and I think that's really true, is to if you get anything out of this podcast, to recognize that it's an emotional issue first and foremost.
Yeah,
That's a
it's
big
not
win
that
right
you're.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, there's other things that we can color things here. People ask me what about, well, no, we can do personality later. I'll just add ADHD right here.
Hmm.
If you have attentional problems, because we're all on a spectrum, and we're somewhere along that distribution, and we can have some problems with short-term memory or attention. Yeah, if you don't remember things, but those are tools. So you can have a better agenda for those sorts of things. We got to remember that procrastination is a voluntary delay of an intended action. If you don't even remember what the intended action was, well, that's a different problem. And you
Hmm.
probably need to listen to an episode that you'll do someday on ADHD, Michael. But we have done some research on ADHD and procrastination. Certainly, they seem like bedfellows, but I'm leery to want to beat someone up with that terrible word procrastination because sometimes it's just I could probably go back to the beginning and say it's inevitable delay. You've got all this other stuff happening, and what results is this inevitable delay because
Hmm.
you're so scattered you can't remember what it
Hmm.
is that you're going to do. But that's just an aside from the main conversation.
Yeah, but you're saying here that there are legitimate biological reasons that people can have to procrastinate, at least as
Or
a
have a breakdown in their self-regulatory
regulatory
skills.
skills. Yes.
Yeah. And so that, because I'm really leery to use the word procrastination, and I want to say, yeah, there's this terrible delay that's really messing things up in your life. But I'm not sure I want to call it procrastination because it doesn't feel so voluntary anymore.
Right, right, right. And let's talk about self-regulatory skills and pre-decisions and intention and
Mm,
if then, because it seems like a good moment to do that. So I'm sitting, I'm sitting here, I have a talk to work on, and it's coming up. And this is this is one of the areas where I realize I really procrastinate. And that is when I have a keynote, and I care a great deal about speaking. It's something I've studied a great deal. I care a lot about it, but I was under the illusion that I work best under pressure. So, and my
mm,
daughter Maya would hammer me about this. You need to start earlier. You need to start earlier because the tension's high and everything else. And so I always did that. And so you're sitting there, and I feel the pressure to work, uh, and I delay over and over again, starting until the pressure gets so high that I finally must start. And there's no question, I don't want to start. I just don't want to because it's
mm.
so much work. A new keynote, it's a really big deal.
Yeah.
So walk us through like the protocol, if you will, to deal with
Hmm.
this. Now I'm recognizing I'm having a negative emotion.
Yeah.
I'm fearful, whatever the underlying emotions are. What's the process to unwind this stuff once we at least recognize that we have these emotional responses?
Okay, we're going to go back to that first step, which is recognize. And I'm going to bring in another familiar name to you, Tara Brock. She's not mentioned in
Mhm.
the book, but I want to go to her because in my own talks, I simplify it that way. But before I go there, I want to get a little bit more into this working better under pressure or only working under pressure. Research shows that when we work under pressure, we make, in the words you've used already, more errors of omission and
Hmm.
commission. So there's
Hmm.
no real evidence that we work better under pressure. There was some research that came out of Korea, I believe. Some colleagues defined the active procrastinator. And these were people they said did work better under pressure, but when you looked at it, it was really purposeful delay because they were really emotionally stable people. They could do it at the last minute, which most of us can't. Now, everyone listening here is saying, no, I'm in that 1% that can do it.
Yes, yes,
Uh,
yes. And I was just sitting
but
there saying, I think I'm one of those.
yes, of
I
course,
swear to God, I
because
hate
we,
to admit it, but I actually did.
oh, I know, but so many listeners will because, well, because of the professionalism and because the accomplishment so far and it's paid off so far. I must be in that 1%. But remember the self-deception we talked about?
Yeah,
John
yeah.
Perry,
It's
we're really
rampant,
good at. Yeah.
rampant.
So there's a wonderful book. It's a little older now. There's other books on habit, but The Power of Habit by Charles
Hmm.
Duhigg.
Hmm.
And Charles writes in that book, and the reason I go back to that book is he says, we push against the deadline to build tension. The release of tension is a powerful reward. And I read that because so many people wonder, why do I keep doing this to myself? Because it is rewarding. I pulled it off again.
That's just it.
But
I enjoy it.
yeah, in a
I
perverse
actually,
way.
in a perverse way, enjoyed the thrill of it. And I think there's a habitual nature in the world of surgery anyway, because we are under pressure all the time. We perform under
Mm-hmm.
pressure. It becomes
Yeah.
like the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really did. I even said to my daughter, I like it. And Andrew Huberman, a very famous
I know.
podcaster, well-known
Yeah.
guy, he
Mm-hmm.
talks all the time about how he loves deadlines and getting under pressure and that he does his best work in those moments.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting because Andrew has done a episode on procrastination. It's one of the few times I've disagreed with him because he thinks it's a motivation problem. He
Yeah,
deep dives into dopamine, and I don't think it's a motivation problem at all. It's an avoidance problem.
it's an
But I've
avoidance problem,
never
and I
never
agree.
talked with Andrew
Yeah,
about that.
yeah.
But now let's go back to, so what do you do about that? And you already prefaced it by saying, okay, I've already got recognition. I've got this negative emotion. Let's just take resentment. At the we can pick any. Anxiety is a
Hmm.
common one.
Hmm.
Um, and this is where I went to Tara Brach because she uses this wonderful acronym RAIN. And
Yeah,
that's how we can remember these four words I'm going to add. So you started with the first one. I've recognized my emotion.
yeah.
Next, I have to accept it. Like just accept that that's what I'm feeling. Um, and then investigate
Don't
it.
run from it. Don't
Don't
run
run
from it.
from it. Yeah.
That's the
And
key. Sit still, as you say. Don't move.
and sit still is quite literal. Keep the seat of your
Literally.
pants on the seat of
Yeah.
your chair.
Don't
Because
get
the
up and
moment
get the
you've
damn
left,
cookie.
that's right.
Don't
Anything. Don't
pick the
do
phone
anything.
up.
Yeah. Yeah. But then the next one is investigate. And most of us think, oh, should I do some psychotherapy? No, investigate it in your body. What does it
Okay.
feel like? Like,
Hmm.
what does it actually feel like to be anxious like this? And paradoxically, the more you're willing to accept it and investigate it, it dissipates.
It
It's
dissipates.
it took work, for example, for you to stay angry at your wife for 5 days. You
It's
know,
an active process,
it is. And at the moment
mentally
you
active
just went
process.
back instead, hugged her and kissed her, it was gone. And
Gone.
and here's the same thing is that I'm facing a task. I'm singing the procrastinator song. You only had the first line. I don't feel like it. The next one is I don't want to. And of course,
Yeah.
I'll feel more like it tomorrow, which we could spend a lot of time just on that.
Yeah.
And so now I've recognized it, I accept it, I've investigated it in my body. And then the final um, N, it goes cuts two ways. Originally, it was non-identify, like don't identify with this. And I'm going to stick with that a minute and simplify it even further with the words of another real biblio mentor of mine, Parker Palmer. He's a
Hmm.
wonderful educator. Uh, um, and he wrote in the book I really enjoyed of his many, which is The Courage to Teach, I can have fear. I need not be my fear. And
Hmm.
that having being is a personal mantra. Um, it's a little bit like Joseph saying, it's okay to feel this way. I can have this feeling. I don't need to be this feeling. In other words, I don't need
Hmm.
to run away from it. I can
Hmm.
just recognize it, accept it, investigate it, and not identify with it. That's the being. Now,
Yeah.
Tara Brach, as you probably know, that takes it further and says, no, I like to use the N as nurture. And that gets
Nurture.
into the
Yeah.
self-compassion that
Yeah.
you know what? There's Kristen Neff will talk about this in terms of this nurturing um, common humanity. Like most people hate doing this.
Yeah.
Of course, you're freaking out. And maybe, of course, you're putting it off. Uh, and I would challenge you just a little bit on how much you like working at the last minute on preparing, because you acknowledge that it takes effort, but there's also a little bit of uncertainty in terms of performance. You might love to talk and you might be gifted at it, but your next performance is still just that. And there's
Mhm.
can be a little undercurrent of fear in there that you're almost,
Chronically,
yeah,
chronically,
good.
chronically,
Yeah.
categorically, chronically.
You're
Yes.
wishing the mountain would go away if you're a mountain
Mhm.
climber. You know you want to climb that mountain, but right now you just wish it would go away. So you procrastinate. And so this self-compassion is, yeah, it's normal to feel. Every mountain climber feels this way. Every speaker feels this way. I can have this feeling. I don't need to be this feeling. And then this is the magic. Now, if you're still listening, as the listeners, I said one of the key things was to think of procrastination as a emotion management problem, not a time management problem. I'm about to give you my number one tip for not procrastinating, and it might get a little ahead of Michael here in the use of the book. But
Doesn't matter.
a magic question I ask myself the moment I say, I have a feeling, not going to be a feeling, is what's the next action? Now, that comes from, let me just take a sip if I could. There is a chapter in the book. There is a chapter in the book entitled Just Get Started. And Michael, I got to tell you that I got all these wonderful emails when that book came out saying, Dr. Pychyl, thanks for sharing all this. I found it very helpful. But you know, sir, if I could just get started, I wouldn't have a procrastination problem. Can you do a little bit better than that, please? And I thought,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a
Well,
lot of things implicit in that very easy phrase of just get started. So I had to go to someone you probably know as well. He wrote Getting Things Done, David
yeah,
Allen.
David Allen. Yeah,
Yeah, a guru for what we traditionally think of as productivity or time management.
right.
And David says, we don't do projects, we don't even do tasks, we do actions. And to me, that's magic.
Mhm.
Because now, if I want to get started on something, even though I'm having these negative emotions, I say I'm not going to be them. What's my next action? And I make that action as tiny as possible. I have to open up my laptop and I just have to read the email that I'm supposed to respond to. I don't make a commitment to responding to it, but I know I can open my laptop and read it. And because anybody can do that. And of course, once I've done that, most of the time, then I'm on to the next step. I'm priming the pump. But I have to be honest with you, on really bad days, because you said at the outset, we can all procrastinate. This is how I don't. On really bad days, I ask that question to myself 100 times. And I think, Tim, you're the most pathetic guy in the world. Why can't you just do your stuff? Tim, you are doing your stuff. It just doesn't feel good under your skin right now. And the way you're getting it done is by asking, what's the next action? And at the end of the day, if I fill out that calendar and all the color coded I tell you about, I go, I'm living the life I wanted to live. I said I was going to do these things today, and I did them. Now, did it feel good? No, but that's where people, lots of things
Yeah,
don't feel good.
yeah,
And
that's right.
I'm just reliving all this past stuff and I'm never going to resolve it. It's okay to feel this way. What's the next action? I can't stress that enough. It's so practical. And you'll know the answer to that when you say, what's the next action? Make it tiny.
Yeah. Ooh, there's a lot there. I'm going to just relate my own experience with, and you said if they're still listening, and I actually think about that too when we're talking about these fuzzy, heart-based principles and emotions and stuff. And my surgeon colleagues are out there thinking I'm tuning out here now. But I went to a self-compassion retreat with Kristen Neff and Chris Germer.
Hmm.
And to say I felt like a fish out of water is a grotesque oversimplification. I almost left after, at the end of the first day. I think I can't do this. I found myself in a huge room sitting on a cushion, putting my hand on my heart and talking about my feelings. Now, this is something I had never, feelings were an impediment to me prior to that. There's something to be ignored in general and just get on with the deal.
Hmm.
But that changed my life. I realized there was something there, and I went back to learn how to teach self-compassion even. And all this stuff. I mean, it just opened up the doorway to a world that I had never experienced before. And your rain or Tara Brach's rain, you know, I learned through all these things to actually interrogate myself now when I'm feeling something. And I'm curious about where it's coming from. I
Hmm.
ask myself, and this is very, very powerful stuff to be able to see and understand and have a grip on what's going on inside of you. And it
Hmm.
allows you much more agency in the way you interact in the world, in my opinion, anyway. Uh,
Oh,
it's revolutionary, and it's something that we are not taught, and I think it should be an essential part of the curriculum for all physicians, since we're in the caring and healing professions. It's really
yes,
important stuff. Yeah.
absolutely. And I like the distinction you made there. You mentioned Sam Harrison passing and waking up. When you were talking about your gut reaction to self-compassion, remind me of Dan Harris in
Yeah.
10%
Oh,
Happier.
he's very, yeah,
Yeah, because he so
he's a
much pushes
curmudgeon
back.
about these things. Yeah.
That's right. But now he's
Yeah.
kind of the other way in
Yeah.
extreme. His
He's gone
next
the other way.
next
Yeah.
book is about love, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But it is it's an epiphany. And
It
I'm hoping
is.
there's an epiphany for people today in terms of the kind of change we're making in our perception about procrastination. So it's not a time management problem. No, it's a self-regulatory failure. So what's the tips and tricks? Well, that's another place I draw on Parker Palmer because he was often asked as a good teacher, how do you do this? What trick do you use? And
Hmm.
he offended by that. He was saying, no, I bring my whole humanity. I
My whole
show up.
humanity.
And when
Yeah.
people meet, the good things happen. And the same thing
Hmm.
here. The solution is that you have to be open yourself up to the things you want to be in the world. Yeah. But I'll let you get back to the chapters and
Well,
um,
but this is so much good stuff here. So let's talk about self-compassion, because when you talk about aversion and being compassionate with ourselves, and how,
mhm.
and you make the analogy to an argument with a friend. Could you kind of elaborate on that? Because I think it's really important how we relate to ourselves, and if we have an argument with ourselves, because like
Yes.
I will be very critical, like, you're lazy asshole, you didn't, what the hell is going on here? Get your ass up and do this. This is kind
Yeah.
of stuff I've got dialogue in my head, like it or
Internalized
not.
self-talk. Yes. And there's
Yeah.
two ways we're going to go at that. I'm going to do two things. And one, I'm going to talk about perfectionism. And then
Hmm.
I'm going to talk about self-forgiveness and an epiphany I had working
Yes.
with a colleague. So the first thing is that people will say are perfectionists procrastinators. And well, we have to differentiate between different flavors of perfectionism because researchers have done that. They've done it broadly with two called perfectionist concerns versus perfectionist strivings. And the
Mhm.
perfectionist concerns are the worries and the rumination, and the strivings are I just like to do things really perfectly. And as a surgeon,
Right.
I'm hoping you're doing that. I just had my right hip replaced. My surgeon did an excellent job, and I love him
Yeah.
for it. So I'm glad that he's has perfectionistic strivings. But there's another way that people frame it, and this I'm thinking of my friend Gord Flett. He's up in Toronto at York University, an outstanding researcher, and he separates them into self-oriented perfectionism, which tastes like the strivings,
Hmm.
other-oriented perfectionism, which sounds a bit like the feedback you got when you did the 360, because you were expecting perfection from others. There was a lack of warmth perceived, at least at that time. That's
Oh, that is the truth.
other-oriented.
Some ways he seems ruthless in his desire to make us strong.
Right.
That's the other part of it. Yeah.
And he expects us to be perfect too, just like he is. And that's other-oriented perfectionism. But the real story with procrastination comes with this flavor called socially prescribed perfectionism. And I caught a hint of that when you were talking about the voices in one's head.
Hmm.
Just suck it up. You can do better than that, or you're not worth it. And these are things we've internalized from others, these internalized expectations from others. And when we measure these things in research, it's the socially prescribed perfectionism that correlates with procrastination. Remember, most of these are correlational studies, not causal studies. So take
Right.
that.
Right.
We're painting a whole picture here with the data, but none of these are kind of the nail in the coffin of causal relations. But together, they tell a story that is the best story we have so far.
And
So
it
social,
also meshes with experiential.
yes, it
Yeah.
does. It's a story that hangs tight. Now the science is always working on how can we perfect the story. We'll see as that unfolds. But right now, we would say socially prescribed perfectionists, they're internalizing this negative talk from others and internalizing it, and they ruminate. And those are the things that leads to procrastination. Why? Because we've just lit up all those negative emotions. I'm useless. I can't succeed. I'm so going to fail. So that's the one end of it. And of course, we can go all over the place with this in terms of perfectionism. In fact, I'd love to read. I have a slideshow not too far from me here, and I'd like to read you two quotes. One is from Roy Baumeister,
Mhm.
and Roy is a prominent social psychologist, one of the most cited psychologists in the world.
Yeah.
And in terms of perfectionism, he wrote, "You don't have to be perfect. Perfectionists tend to be dissatisfied and unhappy. You'd be surprised how many psychological disorders have an element of perfectionism in there. Forget about being perfect. Just concentrate on being good enough." And that has
Mhm.
some interesting flavors from early psychoanalysis. Eliminate the negative, that will get you far. So it's a very powerful message. And of course, we see it in popular books like Brene Brown's The Gifts of Imperfection. We
Yes.
see it in a book like The Spirituality of Imperfection, and even
Mhm.
in the famous poet and singer, a Canadian singer, Leonard Cohen,
Oh,
who wrote
yeah.
so beautifully, "Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything.
But that's a
That's how
light
the
in.
light gets in." Yes,
Yes.
exactly. And that is another personal mantra because most of us never want to look at our cracks, right? In fact, we push hard against those cracks.
Yeah.
But it's not until we embrace them. That's why I resonated to your word vulnerability and recognize that, yeah, I'm only human, common humanity. I have my own cracks. I'm not perfect, but in fact, there's a upside to that, and that's that it's the light gets in. And one more quote, if I could, because
Please.
we're speaking to a broad audience, and everyone's going to capture something a little different today.
Right.
But another wonderful psychotherapist is Esther Perel,
Mhm.
and she does relational counseling, and that's what she's most famous for. But she wrote once, "What is self-esteem? It's the ability to see ourselves as flawed individuals and still hold ourselves in high regard. It's
Mhm.
anything but perfection," right? And most of us, that's a terrible tension. We can't hold ourselves in high regard unless we're being perfect. And the audience we're speaking to, given your surgeons, and is you're going to struggle with that a lot.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
I'm not perfect, I can't hold myself in high regard, and that's a terrible trap to be in. Yeah. So that's the one end.
That.
I said I'd answer the question in two ways. And before I go on to
Yeah.
the second way of doing that, do you have any follow-up?
Well, I just know that in my own life, the things that I've done, like the self-compassion retreat, Sam Harris, the reading, that has allowed me to fully embrace my humanity while at the same time holding myself as having worth, real worth and ability,
Hmm.
and I'm good with myself, basically. I'm really good with myself.
Yes.
That's it. I that's
What
it.
choice do you really have?
No, I
You're
know,
you.
but
Yeah.
it's better than not being good with myself. And I know a lot of people
Yes.
are not good with themselves,
Yes.
and
It's
it's just a
this.
tragedy.
It's huge. Now, you talked about an internal dialogue in a different way, and I almost started here many years ago. He's still at Carleton. He's a really prolific researcher, Dr. Michael Wall. And Michael said, Tim, we should do some research someday on forgiveness. I kind of scoffed and I said, I'd love to do research with you, Michael, but come on, it'll be forgive and forget. Right? He
Yeah,
says, "Oh, don't you be so sure." And I
yeah.
should have known better than to bet against Michael because he's much smarter than I am. Anyhow, we did the research with the graduate student as typical, and she collected data on first year students, which is a captive audience or who are a captive audience. And um, what she found in a nutshell was that students who did poorly on their first exam because they procrastinated, they were our interest. Those who forgave themselves, they actually procrastinated less preparing for the second exam. Those students who did poorly on their first exam because they procrastinated, who didn't forgive themselves, procrastinated again. And I said, "Okay, Michael, I didn't think this would happen. What's going on?" And this is the part where you made me think of this. He said, "Well, Tim, imagine there's a transgression against you and I. Like you didn't show up to lunch when we were going to have lunch. What would be the motivation?" "Oh, I'd avoid Michael. Michael would avoid Tim." "Exactly. But what if I understood then that something came up at home and you couldn't come and I forgave you, what would be the motivation then? Well, it'd be approach. He goes, exactly. Now with procrastination, the transgression is against the self. And so, unless we forgive ourselves, the motivation is to further avoid. So, all we've done is add another layer of avoidance. We avoided we'll take the students, we avoided the studying in the first place because it was aversive to us. It might be like your talk prep, it's too effortful, or it might be that you're really afraid of failure, or you don't even like the course. I'm resenting it and I find it boring, any
Mhm.
of those things. But then, when you do poorly and you don't forgive yourself, now you've added another layer of avoidance.
The
So,
aversion's even bigger
yes,
subsequently.
that's right. You're
Yeah.
just digging a
Yeah.
deeper hole. And so that's why that expression along the lines of forgiveness is not something we do for others, it's something we do for ourselves so that we can move
Mm.
on. And
Yeah.
and it's such a powerful thing even with procrastination. And I offer that up in a powerful way because with that change thing we talked about, embracing change,
Mhm.
that two steps forward, one step back, well, there's going to be days where, yeah, there I am again. Yes, of course you
Yeah.
are.
That's right.
And
Of course you
but
are. Yeah.
but what did Joseph say? Or Sharon Salzberg? Begin again. Right?
Begin again.
Yeah. So
So
all these things, you can see how they come together in a really
totally.
coherent way
Totally.
to help us be the person that we want to be.
Yeah. Oh my God, there's just so much wonderful stuff here. And, I think this forgiveness, self-forgiveness thing is so counterintuitive, at least for surgeons, because when you screw something up in the OR, it's very
Mm,
difficult. You have an enormous sense of responsibility and guilt even. And
mm,
and then, I know in the training, it's much less what's the right word here? Brutal, I think, these days in terms of how you're treated by people. It still exists.
mhm,
The recrimination, the denigration, the hammering people, that sort of thing. I mean, that was rife in my day. And you say we internalize some of these things, and that's where, it can come from home, it can come from your training, how you talk to yourself. But it feels through training and with the stakes being so high, the illusion is that you need to be hammered and you need to hammer yourself to accomplish and do the best job you can. And in fact,
right.
what you just told us is that just creates more aversion, it creates more negative emotions, and it leads to lower performance and procrastination and avoidance even of operating, or wanting to
Yeah.
to do cases. So this
Yeah.
is very counterintuitive, and I suspect for a lot of the listeners is be like, what the hell are you talking about? That doesn't make sense. It doesn't jive with my experience here. Because we've
Yes,
made a
but then
false correlation with the hammering with success.
yes, that's one part of it. But then the fact that it feels uncomfortable is that we're not comfortable with paradoxes. And the opposite of
I
one great
love
truth,
paradoxes.
well, the paradox is the heart of mysticism in so many ways too. The opposite
Yeah,
of one great truth is typically another great truth. And
yeah.
so, having just had my hip surgery, I want my, I don't want my surgeon to come back and talk about his imperfection, of course. But when it bleeds into the rest of your life, and
Yeah.
when it bleeds into how we act towards other people and expectations, that's problematic. You remember when I talked about perfectionism, I said perfectionistic strivings. Of course, I want to do the job as well as I can. Is it possible to believe I will never make a mistake? That's insane, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
we have to be able to live within that tension of I will strive to do my very best, but I'll always be honest about any mistake I make and know that it's only human. Like there's that expression to err is human. Now, if you err too many times, then there's something you're going to have to do about that. But
Correct.
that's
Yeah.
another issue, right? It's not an excuse for um, all these things you talked about in terms of how we treat others in training or how we treat
Hmm.
our staff or ourselves. So yeah, I guess it's always going to feel uncomfortable that way.
Yeah. Um,
Hmm.
let's go back now to just get started because I think this is a crucial thing, and and then we can kind of close out with the talk thing, my talk. The just get started, and there's a I love Tara Brock, I love Kristen Neff, I love Chris Germer, and I also love Jocko Willink, a Navy SEAL who's retired and who's a big thinker on a lot of these topics.
Is he the
And
make your
he's
bed
just
guy?
no, that's I'm blocking McRaven. He's McRaven,
Okay.
but he's a Navy SEAL too, and
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
commander. But Jocko's big line is discipline equals freedom. If you
Mhm.
have the discipline to do the things you're supposed to do, you will have freedom. You'll have freedom from
Yes.
health problems, you'll have financial freedom, et cetera, et cetera. And that's clearly a theme here. But the conflation, in my opinion, is that the discipline requires, like, I got to go out and run 10 miles, right? Those sorts of things. But it really
Mhm.
is, and I've learned this, it's just getting started. And so when I pull up and I go to the gym, I mean, I've got two hip replacements, two shoulder replacements.
I know
I
you
go
told
to
me that.
I go to the gym. I mean, I go to the gym every day. I lift weights, and I tell you, and especially at 70 with all my joint shit, I pull up sometimes and I'm sitting in the car and I'm in the winter in Minnesota and I'm like, screw this. You know, I can't bear to get out and have that wind hit me and
Uh-huh.
then crawl my 70-ass-year-old body into the gym with all the joints and go through the motions. It was fine
Mhm.
when I was 35 and all, full of hormones and everything else.
Mhm.
But boy, once I get started, everything's
Yes.
fine. It's just fine. And then this gets at the motivation issue. So maybe you'll touch on some of that here and the getting started thing. But this is true of everything. It's
Well,
literally
there's a famous saying in amongst behavioral economists that we're predictably irrational.
mhm.
Dan Ariely. Ariely.
Really? Yeah. I don't know how
Yeah.
to pronounce his last
Me,
name. Yeah.
I do know how. I just pronounce it incorrectly every time I open my mouth. Um, Dan Iorelli, I think, but you can look him up. I mean,
Yeah.
he has a book called Predictably Irrational,
Yeah.
and what I'm drawing on here is that not only um, once we just get started, do we do the workout, but let's imagine it's on a stationary bicycle. I'll often say to people, "Yeah, I don't feel like getting on it, so just put your bum on the seat and just start moving your legs."
A
10
little
minutes,
bit.
10 yeah, and then there you start going. 10 minutes later, you're convinced you could do the Tour de France. That's the predictably irrational
That's
part.
pretty,
Like
I
we go
know.
from I can't do it to illusions of grandeur. And
Yes.
in that is the story too of how we have to stop believing our mind. And not to borrow too much on these Buddhist themes, but they're always bubbling in the background, is that does become the problem. That we're not our thoughts. And just because I have a thought, and we go back to another theme, I can have it, I don't have to be it,
Mhm.
because I don't even know
Just
where
like
some of these thoughts
emotions.
come from.
Yeah.
Yeah, just like emotions. Because
Mhm.
what does the brain, what's the brain evolved to do? Think and feel, think and feel. And as you've been listening to this podcast, you've been thinking and feeling all sorts of things. Maybe some of the stuff that Michael's predicted in terms of reaction to some of the content, maybe other things completely we have no idea about, but you're thinking and feeling, thinking and feeling. And the Buddhists will call that monkey mind.
Yeah.
And we have to just recognize that and say, yeah, despite all that, what am I going to do? And then what's that magic phrase? What's the next action?
What's the
Knowing
next
that
section?
what's happening there is just getting started. And the first time we ran into that, and that's where the chapter came, I did a pager study on campus. Now, this is before students had cell phones. What beautiful those days those were.
Oh, I know.
I know. And laptops. There was not a laptop in the room or a cell phone because they weren't there. So
I
I had to
I go
buy
back to
little
the days when we
pagers.
wrote in paper charts and there was no computers on the ward. I mean,
That's what I used to do overhead projections. That's because
yes.
I'm also in my 70th year, so maybe 1 year behind you. Anyhow, we shouldn't reminisce on the good old days because they weren't that so good because we have people copying down stuff and they don't need to be scribes. But in any case, the get started was I put pagers on these students, and of course I could page them. It's called experience sampling throughout the week. And I'd say, "What are you doing?" "Oh, hanging out in a coffee shop with my friends." "How enjoyable is that? How stressful, how difficult?" "Oh, really enjoyable, not stressful, not difficult." "Is there something you should be doing?" "Oh, yeah, I should be studying for my stats exam." "Well, how enjoyable is that?" It's in the toilet." "And stressful and difficulty?" "Off the scale." And so we could continue to page them throughout the week, which we did. And finally, the night before, they were down on that stats assignment, not surprisingly. But what we found is that their difficulty ratings dropped significantly, statistically
Mhm,
significantly.
mhm.
Their enjoyment went up statistically. Not that they would necessarily choose to do it, but it wasn't nearly as bad as they thought. And their question was always when we did this, just random thoughts, like, "What are you thinking?" "Why did I wait so long? Like, I can do this. I'd do a
Yes.
better job if I had more time." So it
Yeah.
was huge to me. I thought, like, that just laid it bare, something we all know from personal experience, but it came across over and over again in aggregate data that we all play this trick on ourselves, and we add, I'll feel more like it tomorrow. I work better under pressure. These are all rationalizations because we like cognitive consistency.
Mhm.
So in all of that, then this just gets started is a magic bullet.
Rationalizations you mentioned and excuses, right? So I just I just want to say there's a video that I send to everybody and I'll send it to you. It's by Jocko Willington, Navy SEAL, and it's entitled "All Your Excuses Are Lies." And which they are. They're
Yes.
almost uniformly lies, but he goes through them all. You don't have the gear, you don't have the right equipment,
Hmm.
I'm too tired, I'm too old, all these things. Lies, 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 lies,
Yes.
and I that really had an impact on me when I saw that video because it made it clear what is the bullshit upstairs.
Yes, and I'll often give talks that can stretch for an hour and a half or longer. And afterwards, someone will come up to me and say, I really like that 2 minute rule. And I'm thinking, that was David Allen's, and that wasn't my focus. But since I've mentioned, I'm going to tell you what it is. There's a 2 minute rule and a 5 minute rule.
Yeah,
And your tiredness made me think of that. A 2 minute rule is if something's going to take 2 minutes, do it right now. Like if I'm walking through the kitchen and I see that the
yeah.
sink is full, it takes 2 minutes to clean that. Just do it.
Hmm.
The 5 minute rule speaks more to the being too tired, that lie or excuse we
Hmm.
tell ourselves.
Hmm.
Well, if you feel too tired, then just do it for 5 minutes. If in 5 minutes you really are exhausted, you'll know and you can
Yeah,
stop. But then that
yeah,
predictably irrational part of it is, oh, this is great. I could go forever.
yeah,
So yeah,
yeah.
there's so many people who have spoken to this because it is the human condition. And so for those people struggling with procrastination, all of these things can come together to make a difference. And you will be able to pick and choose key things that are going to make a difference in your life.
That's right. And that's it. Pick and choose. You have agency over these things. Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. And
You,
that sense of agency though is crucial. In fact, for a lot of younger people, I think that's what's missing sometimes is they don't
mhm.
recognize that you're authoring your own life here. Uh, and authoring it means you have to be an active agent in it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just highlight those words. You are authoring your own life, and what's the story that's going to be at the end of the day?
Yeah.
That's will
Yeah.
be a story at the end of the day. We'll come back to my talk and we can wrap this up. So the last keynote I gave was at the University of Colorado, and that was about a month ago now. And I decided to start 3 months earlier than the usual 3 to 4 weeks. And
Hmm.
what that allowed me, first of all, in my opinion, whether that's accurate or not, it was one of the best keynotes I ever gave. All right.
Ah.
That's my opinion. And there was a lot of really great feedback that came
Hmm.
afterwards through
Hmm.
texts and other things and the responses. Be that as it may, whether my perceptions are accurate about whether it's the best one I've ever given, for me, the key part was it was actually fairly enjoyable. I really enjoyed the process because I gave myself the time and space to really contemplate and think
Hmm.
about the things that I was talking about instead of like, I got to get these slides, I got to get this down. And just the time and space to really digest and ponder was
Hmm.
always missing in that crunch approach. I had big pieces of paper, writing things down, looking for
Right.
correlations, something I've never done before. And
Hmm.
I, it was fantastic. And it changed my entire approach to the talk and the whole talk. It was a totally different experience. And it was the nail in the coffin on the procrastination piece for speaking for me. I'm never doing that
Right.
again. I will
Right.
always
Right.
be well in advance. And so it is an illusion, in my opinion, that, I work better under pressure, and I was literally
Yeah.
on my phone with my son, and he just brought this up because I talking about procrastination. He says, I know I really work better under pressure. And I hated to disavow him of that, of this lie, but I mean, he understood what I was telling him. And so we all often think that, and it's just not true.
Yes. I gave a public talk in Toronto, which major city in Canada,
I
very
trained there.
diverse. Oh, did you? Okay,
Yeah,
well, this was at
University of
the
Toronto.
Arts and Letters Club, which is a interesting club in itself because it's where the group of seven hung out and lots of intellectuals. And so it was
Wow. Yeah.
really heady for
Yeah.
me to be invited to give a
No
public
kidding.
address there. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. And a lot of artists and writers came and we talked about working better under pressure. And I had them come up after the talk, just like you had. And they said, they gave me examples of composers who'd say, no, you might think you work better under pressure, but you don't. Real artists and writers, they show up. They're duty men, and they have to,
They are.
as one composer put it, they have to get under the piano and chew the rug. Like
Yeah.
it's hard work,
It's hard
uh,
work.
and
Yeah.
so it's not a matter of waiting for your muse, and that we
Yeah.
don't work better under pressure, and we tell ourselves these things. And so it was really refreshing for me to see it come from different walks of life, particularly the art community. Yeah.
Yeah. Inspiration comes from work, from
Yeah,
doing
and
the
that's
work.
well, you talked about this, maybe you talk about motivation. Yeah, we in social psychology many years ago, it was found that attitudes don't predict behavior, but behavior predicts attitudes. Like once you
Hmm.
get doing something, it affects your attitude. And likewise with action, fuels motivation. It's not that, oh, I need to feel motivated. When I hear that, I often think, are you a teenager? Because one of mine just walked in the house. Time to do the dishes. I don't feel like it. I'm not
I don't
motivated.
feel like it. Yeah.
I didn't
I'm not
ask you what you
motivated.
felt like doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's time to do the dishes. And if I
Yeah.
could, I'll give one more. And it's my favorite Zen story. This monk arrives at a new monastery and hits the headmaster and he says, well, I'm here, teach me. And the master says, have you had your breakfast? And he says, yeah. He said, then wash your bowl. And
Hmm.
one of my friends, well, the guy from Utrecht, he made me a T-shirt that says "Wash your bowl" because
Hmm.
it's one of my big mantras that it's the action. It's
It's
don't
the
make any
action.
more of it than
Yeah.
that. Like you can stew over like why do I always have to wash the bowl? And I don't feel like washing the bowl. No, just wash the bowl.
Just do it. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
again,
Well,
just do
that's a
it. And
careful one.
I've caught myself, thanks to you. I caught myself. Maybe you want to just elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, just do it is a wonderful Nike slogan.
Yeah.
And in a sense, it does capture you getting to the gym, but you wouldn't have got to the gym on that slogan, quite frankly. Just get started gets us,
Just get started.
yeah, gets
Yes.
us doing it. Because if you think, and we can dive into some psychology here, that it's called level of identification of action. And if we get into the nitty gritty of our plans and think about everything I have to do, it's overwhelming. But if I
Overwhelming.
just think of that next step and just get started, then the affective barrier goes down and I just get started. And once I'm into it, then I'm not thinking at all. I'm not, in fact, all of my attention is on acting now, not
Hmm.
about ruminating and worrying. Right. So
Yeah.
really,
That's the key thing.
I'm glad that we hit that by accident because it's
Yeah.
not the Nike expression as much as it's a powerful marketing tool. It's just get started.
Just get started. And I just want to say, Rich Roll, a very famous podcaster, he has a phrase that I is absolutely spot on and apropos to this discussion. Mood follows action.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
it.
That's it.
And it
That's it.
really is true.
Yeah.
Really is
And
true.
if you procrastinate, where's your mood going to be? Well, I never told you my origin story for why I studied procrastination.
That was
I
one of my
did.
final questions.
Oh, okay. Well, I didn't do my
Here we are.
PhD on procrastination. I was studying personal well-being, subjective well-being, and I was actually looking at, um, we know personality can predict well-being, but I was also interested in how our personal projects, our doings in the world would predict our well-being. And it accounts
You're
for,
talking about Brian Little's material now.
yeah, Brian Little was my advisor.
Good God, are you serious?
Yeah,
Oh,
he's one of my heroes, of course. That
he's one of my heroes too. I mean, he was on the podcast, and I've been working with him with Principles U and Big Five, and and
excellent.
that stuff. Yeah, I just
Well,
love
Brian was
him.
my
He's such a
personal
wonderful
advisor.
man. Yeah,
Yeah, if we had more time, I'd tell you how I met him. I was working in an outdoor store as a canoe guide and outfitter. Actually, those are separate things. I was an outfitter at that time, and I started doing a night class, and I met him, and I
is
went,
that
"Oh
right?
my
Yeah,
God!" Right?
yeah,
He just
yeah,
lit the fire for learning for me, and he
yeah.
was my advisor. So long story short, I did a two-part study for my PhD. One of it was interviewing, qualitative. The other part was quantitative. And in the qualitative analysis, everyone was talking about the procrastination. And in the quantitative analysis, when I put that in there, and I won't explain how, it accounted for the variance in their well-being. And if I knew their procrastination score, I knew their well-being, and it was in the toilet. And
Wow.
so when I defended that exam, my external examiner said, "So what's next, Tim?" And I said, "I'm going to stop studying what people are doing, the personal projects, and start studying what people say they're going to do, but never do, because that's where the story of
Mhm.
well-being rests. That's the thing that undermines, gets in the way of us really thriving." So yeah, that's an interesting, Brian. Yeah,
Oh yeah. What a incredibly wonderful man,
he
just a
is.
heart of
Yes.
gold. Yeah.
Yeah, he is
And
all of those things.
it's and such a contributor to the world of personality science. I mean,
Yep.
my Lord, really
Oh, and
remarkable.
I stand on his shoulders. Like he was my teacher for years.
How about that? Yeah.
Hmm.
It's just fantastic. Yeah.
Hmm. What a small world.
Yeah. Okay, so, one there's one last point I want to really bring a little attention to. So let's say we just get started. I'm sitting at the computer, I'm starting to write, and I'm feeling good. I cracked out an hour of writing, and I'm thinking, well, I'll just quit here and what what are the perils of being kind of puffed up in the moment, having succeeded with the first effort at beating procrastination by just starting on something. Do you understand what I'm
Interesting.
asking? I mean, there are
Yeah.
pitfalls in our thinking that can occur that you've highlighted in your book. Like, oh, I've got this. I can just put that off now for a while till tomorrow. You can start to, I'm not paraphrasing it correctly, but do you know what I'm talking about here?
I think so, in the sense that
The need to be
I'm,
prepared to deal with obstructions, obstacles, and setbacks.
yeah, we didn't even talk about Peter Gallwertz's notion of implementation intentions, although you wanted me to earlier. Um,
That's right.
an implementation intention, we all have intentions. Like we have a goal intention, like one of our goal intentions was to meet and do a podcast. An implementation intention is in situation X, alter behavior Y. It's much more, as the word sounds like, how am I going to implement this intention? And they're very powerful. So Peter Gallwitzer has initiated a huge research program, started back in the 90s, on implementation intentions, and that's been taken forward by his wife, who has written a book on a technique called Whoop. You can go to whoop.org, I believe it is, to whoop up your life, where you
Okay.
look at what do you wish would happen, what's the outcome that would come if you achieve that wish? What's the obstacle or what's getting in the way? And then what's the plan, which is the implementation intention? And
Mhm.
so it's an interesting planning tool. And so these are things that can help you stay on track. So you don't just get
Staying
started
on
and say,
track. Yes, that's what
that's
I'm talking
enough.
about. Yes.
That's enough for today. You see, the problem with two things, and I'm going to go to the first one and come back to yours, is that sometimes people will feel under a lot of stress and feel out of control. And so they'll make a plan and
It
they'll
feels
say,
good.
these are the things that, and yeah, feels good. And guaranteed, what you're going to see is that, and it starts tomorrow. It doesn't start right
Mhm.
now.
Tomorrow I'm doing
Yeah, that's
it.
right. Because it feels good. And what you've done is mood repair. It's another form of giving in to feel good.
Mood
So
repair, mood repair. Let's just say that a few times. Mood repair. Yeah.
mood repair. That's
Yeah.
that's the story of procrastination from our perspective.
Right.
Now, with implementation intentions in situation X, I'll do behavior Y. When I reach an obstacle, like I feel like quitting or I feel too tired, then I will just and so do another problem or make another what's the next action intention. So you've
Hmm.
already made a pre-commitment to your action. You're not caught there thinking, what should I do? Because you know what you feel like doing. Instead, you've made this pre-commitment. Now, pre-commitment's a very common thing among behavioral economists too. You can pre-commit to things in the sense that maybe I don't go to the gym as easily as you do, or don't have that self-discipline. So instead, I pre-commit by making an appointment with you. And not only that, I make the pre-commitment. And if I don't show up, here's an envelope addressed to a campaign that I don't want to give to. But if I don't show
Hmm.
up, you just mail that, right? And I know
Yeah.
there's $100 going to a campaign I do not want to support. Well, those are pre-commitment devices. Another common example is I keep pressing the snooze button on my alarm in the morning. My better self the night before puts the alarm on the other side of the room. I've made a pre-commitment that I've got to get my
Hmm.
sorry butt out of bed
Hmm.
to do my
Hmm.
that easy behavior. In fact, there's a whole research paradigm around here called extended will. You know, we have extended mind. If I say to you, what's 3 times 3, you'll say 9, no problem. And if I say, what's 476 divided by 15, you might say, I don't do that in my head. But if I gave you a tool, no problem. Well, why do we think we can extend our mind but not extend our will? Why does it always have to be an internal resource like self discipline? So instead, I make these pre commitments. I make a commitment to you because I'd never let you down. I make a pre-commitment in terms of something that I'd find punishing. So we can structure our world around us to help us not do the thing that's easy for us to do, but to do the thing that we find more difficult, but that we want to achieve.
Hmm.
So there's a roundabout answer to your question about if I just get started and then I think, well, that's enough for today because I feel good
Hmm.
now. I got
Hmm.
started. I could have already made a implementation intention that when I think this, then I will do that. And
Yeah.
those things have been found to be helpful because we're not left making the decision in our weakest point.
Yeah. On an ad lib basis.
Yeah, and we know the outcome at that point because we want to let go.
Yeah.
But because we anticipate that, it's yeah, the same is true of um, if I say that I'm going to work on my talk today, if my friends call to invite me out, I'll say no. I already made the commitment. No, I'm busy because I've made a commitment to my talk. You've already made that decision. You don't have to rethink it.
Right.
Yeah. So now you can make that your own. How would you make that fit in your own context?
Yeah, because that's a good example, and you use a similar example in the book. And you're doing something, and somebody calls, and it's very tempting, and it's a good friend. And what is your commitment level at that point? So the
Mhm.
pre-decisions, as you call them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
as I call them from the literature, this is not my work. Remember, this is not the world as Tim sees it, but the world as Tim's distilled it from lots of
of
good
course, a
researchers.
lot
Yeah.
of people. Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, and wrapping up, I just had a thought here, and see if you agree with this. Reputation, our reputation with other people depends on a lot of things, but reliability, follow through, you do what you say you're going to do. And if you don't, well, your reputation suffers and you are seen as sort of unreliable and maybe flaky. And that's not a reputation that I've ever had or wanted with people. Maybe there have been times, of course, so yeah, certainly. But I really do try very hard to fulfill my commitments to others that I've made. I'm very serious about that. I think is there a parallel here in terms of commitment to ourselves? Our reputation with ourselves, is there a theme that's worth thinking about there?
The most common emotion associated with procrastination is guilt.
Hmm.
And when procrastination becomes a habit, then it turns into shame.
Yeah,
And
which is a toxic
partly that
emotion.
that is a toxic emotion, and there's lots written about that. And one of the reasons it does that is that evolutionarily speaking, we do need to be able to read others and know if we can count on others. And
Hmm.
that's why you mentioned in passing uh, Brian Little's work on the big five. And one of them is conscientiousness. Now, we
Hmm.
didn't get into this, but conscientiousness shares a very high zero order correlation with procrastination. Some people have even thought they're almost identical. And some scholars have called it the source trait. So if I lack conscientiousness, which means I'm not very dutiful or organized or self disciplined, then procrastination is probably a problem for me. Well, in terms of the major traits, it's there because we need to be able to tell, are you someone I can count on? That's the example you
Hmm.
used.
Hmm.
And so, likewise, we feel shame in ourselves when we're procrastinating all the time because it's a strongly biased social emotion. We are social animals.
Yeah,
So, yeah, so it's reflected within ourselves, but certainly, the kind of work that we see done on procrastination in groups, social loafing, as an example, it's a negative characteristic for a group member.
yeah. Well, Tim, I can't thank you enough. This has been one of the most enjoyable conversations I've had.
Me too.
It's really just been
Surprisingly a
lovely.
great deal. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
me too. I
really a
didn't know
lot of
what to
great stuff.
expect that, and I'm
Yeah.
just Great conversation.
Yeah. And what's so wonderful about it, not only I think we learned a great deal about procrastination, but also we learned a great deal about being a human being here because that's essentially what it's all about. And being gentler with ourselves, opening our heart up, our vulnerabilities, and it's just a way to live. It's a better way to live. I had to learn that the hard way, but it's all right here in this conversation, in my opinion. So thank you so
Well,
much for your time and your
well,
expertise and your wisdom.
well, thank you. I'm. It's been a wonderful conversation. I've been honored to join you. I had no idea what to expect, of
I
course.
know, surging out of the blue asking.
Yeah, well, that's the
But,
way best things happen
yeah.
in life. I think now you mentioned in passing a couple times waking up, and I have a series on waking up. And so if
Are you kidding?
listeners,
And I didn't see that.
yeah, it's in there.
Holy mackerel, man.
Sam invited me a few years ago, Sam and his team. And so there's a 10 session series. And if you go to procrastination.ca, which is my um,
Hmm.
homepage, but it's changed since I was an academic. So now it's just this retired guy's homepage. And I start by saying, this is my most recent work with on the Waking Up app, and you can, as you know very well, that listeners can have a free access for a month to Waking Up, and there's a
Hmm.
link off my homepage. So if you want to do a deep dive into the kind of things that you and I were talking about, maybe a bit more methodically, I lay that out in a way, and I do a bit more with future self and a few topics that we didn't get to cover. So that's something else listeners could think about.
Oh, thank God you brought that up. And I'm embarrassed I didn't know about that, given my extraordinary love for that app. That app has changed my life. And, but I have a tendency I listen to Joseph Goldstein's lectures and James Lowe and Alan
Yeah,
Watts over and over again. I mean,
yes,
the more I immerse myself in them, the happier I am. It's
yes.
wonderful stuff.
I really resonate to Joseph the most, and I
Yeah.
read Alan Watts when I was an undergrad, so that's my first introduced to it all.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think very highly of the app, and so yeah, I only offer that up as another way to do this more sequentially because I had to think about how would I present this, but it
Oh,
follows
fantastic.
some of the book for sure.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up. And I'll tell you, this is just proof you're running with the big dogs. And
Well, I
I'm
am
not talking
now,
about
Michael.
me. I'm
I
talking about
am.
Sam Harris.
No, no, Michael, it's just a treat. I've experienced your whole humanity here and your honesty, and it's been refreshing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. This has been The Resilient Surgeon, a podcast brought to you by the Society of Thoracic Surgeons. Thank you so much for listening. If you like this podcast, please rate it 5 stars and let your friends, trainees, and colleagues know about it. On social media, you can use the hashtag #BeYourBestSelf. More information about the Society of Thoracic Surgeons is available online at sts.org.